Welcome to the Indiana Lawyer Podcast. I'm your host, Maura Johnson, and today I'm joined by an expert to help break down what's happening with the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency across the country and how that impacts immigration operations here in Indiana. Jimmy Gurulé is a professor of law at the University of Notre Dame School of Law and is the founder and faculty director of the school's Exoneration Justice Clinic. Prior to that, he was a federal prosecutor, and from 2001 to 2003, Professor Gurulé served as undersecretary for enforcement at the U.S. Treasury Department, which included overseeing the directors of departments including Customs, Border Patrol, and Immigration Enforcement. In this episode, Gurulé shares his thoughts about the actions ICE and Border Patrol agents have taken in the past few weeks and explains what's typically expected of them in U.S. cities and along the nation's borders. He also dispels rumors about what's happening with ICE enforcement here in Indiana and offers his perspective on what's happening on the ground in Minneapolis and how recent high-profile police actions are affecting public trust in federal law enforcement. We recorded this episode on January 30th before the Department of Homeland Security announced additional information regarding the investigation into the shooting of Alex Preddy, and before new body camera standards were announced for ICE and Homeland Security officers working in Minneapolis. On the day of our conversation, United States Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche told the Associated Press that the Department of Justice had opened a civil rights investigation into the shooting of Preddy, who was killed by Border Patrol agents on January 24th. According to the AP, Blanche did not explain why the department decided to investigate the shooting, but he said a similar investigation is not warranted for the death of Minneapolis resident Renee Good on January 7th. And on February 2nd, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem announced on X, formerly known as Twitter, that every Homeland Security and ICE officer working in Minneapolis will be issued body-worn cameras immediately. She also said that cameras will be distributed to officers across the country as funding permits. In this episode, Gurulé emphasizes the need for officers to wear body-worn cameras as they work in U.S. cities. Before we get into the episode, here's a word from our sponsor, Taft.
Taft, today's modern law firm. At Taft, we cultivate a highly respectful, transparent workplace that fosters creativity, teamwork, inclusion, and diversity. We couple our culture with a client-first approach, rewarding lawyers who understand their clients' goals and work to deliver success. Taft, the modern law firm. To learn more, visit taftlaw.com.
Just to start off, can you just start by explaining your background and how you kind of are able to speak on this topic and have knowledge of it?
Well, before I joined the law faculty at Notre Dame, I was a prosecutor for 9 years. I worked as a federal prosecutor for 6 years. I was a state prosecutor for 3 years. I worked as an assistant U.S. attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles for 4 years of the total of 9 years working as a prosecutor. In that capacity, I worked very closely with not only federal law enforcement agencies such as the FBI and the DEA and Customs Service, but also with state and local law enforcement agencies. And then in 2001, I was appointed by President George W. Bush to serve as undersecretary for enforcement for the U.S. Department of the Treasury. And I was sworn into office shortly before the 9/11 terror attacks. And my responsibilities as undersecretary required me to work very closely with the U.S. Customs Service. In fact, that was one of the agencies that I supervised as undersecretary at that time. The Customs Service, including ICE and Customs and Border Patrol, they were Treasury law enforcement agencies. Now they are part of the Department of Homeland Security. But at that time, in 2001 to 2003, they were agencies whose directors reported directly to me as undersecretary.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't realize that they were originally under Treasury. That's super interesting.
Mm.
Can you just explain what the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency is and what they are assigned to do?
Well, they're a federal law enforcement agency, and they're responsible for enforcing the immigration laws. And so that includes detaining, and arresting individuals that they have probable cause to believe that are in the country in violation of federal law, specifically the immigration laws. So that's their primary function.
And what does training look like for these officers? And once they're under their jobs, what are they legally allowed to do to enforce?
Well, if we look at the federal law enforcement officers that have been assigned to Minneapolis, it's really a combination. I mean, it's a combination of ICE officers, Immigration Customs Enforcement, but also U.S. Customs and Border Patrol officers. And those two law enforcement agencies, even though they're both part of the Department of Homeland Security, they have important duties and responsibilities that are different from one another. For example, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, they are deployed primarily along the southern border, within about 100 miles of the southern border. And their responsibility, of course, is to protect the border, to ensure that that illicit drugs are not coming across the border, to protect against individuals that are coming into the country without proper legal authorization. And so when those officers are moved to the city like Minneapolis to work with ICE, it's really a very different environment for them. And that's not where they are accustomed to working. And their duties working on the border don't involve going door to door, executing search warrants, arresting and detaining people on the street. They may do some of that, but it's really not their primary function and responsibility. Having said that, both law enforcement agencies, Customs and Border Patrol and ICE, attend the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center of FLETC and receive federal law enforcement training. And that includes, at least I believe it includes, training on the Constitution and limitations and restrictions of the Constitution imposes on these law enforcement agencies, including the Fourth Amendment prohibition on unreasonable searches and seizures.
Harkening back a little bit to what you were saying, that it's these Border Patrol agents aren't usually sent to these cities. Has this happened before where they are brought into cities like Minneapolis? Is this unusual?
It is unusual, for sure. It is definitely unusual. And typically, again, you would have ICE working hand in hand with local law enforcement agencies. And of course, the local police, that is their duty. They have training working on the streets, arresting individuals on the street, detaining individuals, executing search warrants. That's what they do every day. And so typically it's ICE working with local law enforcement. You don't see a Customs and Border Patrol being brought up and participating in that capacity, except on a rare occasion, because I think ultimately the view is it's not necessary, that you have local law enforcement and you have ICE and they work together. And however, that partnership, that collaboration has broken down during the first year of the Trump administration.
So you recently spoke to the Associated Press talking about, in your experience as a federal prosecutor and undersecretary, you've seen these turf battles between federal and state authorities, but what's happening in Minneapolis is unprecedented. Can you explain? I know we talked about it earlier, but can you explain why you see that from your experience?
Yeah, well, I have seen federal and state and local law enforcement agencies disagree on occasion, maybe engage in some disputes over turf. This is my area. This is my responsibility. You're infringing in my area. This is the agency that should be in charge of this aspect of the investigation, not you. That's not an uncommon scenario. But what I haven't seen is state law enforcement agency file in court a petition for a temporary restraining order against a federal law enforcement agency to prevent the federal law enforcement agency from destroying evidence in an ongoing investigation. That's unheard of. That's unheard of. That type of disagreement, where there's such distrust, where the relationship between the two agencies has broken down to such a degree that state and local is seeking the court's intervention to prevent federal law enforcement agencies from destroying relevant evidence in an ongoing investigation. That kind of distrust is exceedingly rare, if not unprecedented. And it just highlights and demonstrates how the relationship between these law enforcement agencies has deteriorated to this extent, to this degree. And that's not common. That's not usual at all.
Yeah, that was going to be something else that I asked was how often are we seeing ICE agents collaborating with local law enforcement? Did it start off strong during when Trump was first brought in, or has it deteriorated? What does that look like?
Well, I think part of the problem has just been this so-called surge of federal law enforcement officers being transferred to cities such as Los Angeles and Minneapolis. And what we've seen in Minneapolis is that there's been upwards of 3,000 federal law enforcement officers brought into that city, a city of roughly 500,000 people, maybe a little over 500,000 people. And the number of federal law enforcement officers, they're double or triple the number of local law enforcement officers. And so it's been very, very problematic.
Obviously, Governor Brown's been very vocal about wanting the state to cooperate with federal immigration efforts. We've seen that with the use of the Miami Correctional Facility. But is ICE currently operating in Indiana? What does that look like for us?
Well, they do have an ICE field office located in Indianapolis. So there's presence of ICE certainly in Indianapolis. And we know that there's an ICE detention center that is included within the Miami Correctional Facility in Bunker Hill. And this is a collaborative effort between the Department of Corrections, Indiana Department of Corrections, and ICE, and where they've entered into an agreement to make as many as 1,000 beds available for detaining immigrants that have been detained by ICE. So they are working. ICE does have a footprint, I think a significant footprint in Indiana. What we haven't seen in Indiana is that the surge of ICE agents, the presence of ICE agents at a very high level, similar to what we've seen in Minneapolis and Los Angeles and in several other cities.
I've seen personally a lot of rumors on social media that ICE has hotels booked or operations planned for certain school districts. What advice do you have for listeners who are trying to separate fact from rumor online in these types of situations?
Yeah, it's a real problem because I think the rumor can create a lot of anxiety within the community, and because this anxiety can grow into fear, where parents are fearful of taking their children to school, fearful that they could be arrested, that their children could be detained, that ICE could show up at schools, that ICE could show up at the workplace. And so it's a serious problem. I think one thing is that they shouldn't believe everything that they read on social media. Rumors very often are just not true, and they should wait until there's some credible facts presented to them before they start reacting in a way that may be counterproductive to them individually.
And reflecting on that, would you say that when it comes to the use of force, is that maybe choice based on individual officers, or is it kind of orders that they've been given to use type of force?
Yeah, it's a good question. First of all, one other thing that distinguishes the local law enforcement and the ICE and the Customs and Border Patrol officers is that the federal officers are wearing a mask. You don't see local law enforcement officers covering their face. Maybe in some extreme, unique law enforcement operation. But here, the ICE officers and the Customs and Border Patrol officers are covering their faces always and all of the activities that they're engaged in. And so that raises a question of, well, is there a legitimate law enforcement purpose for these ICE officers to disguise themselves, to cover their face? And if so, why don't we see Minneapolis law enforcement doing the same? So there's a concern there, but why you asked the question of why is this happening? Are they doing this on their own, or are they being directed by their supervisors? Well, I think the covering their face is certainly coming from higher ups, coming from their supervisors. And then we see them driving in unmarked vehicles. We see them not only arresting immigrants that are in the country without proper documentation, but there are numerous reported cases of ICE officers arresting and detaining and arresting U.S. citizens. There have been several, dozens and dozens, hundreds of instances where they have unlawfully arrested U.S. citizens suspected of being in the country illegally.
Yeah. So now moving on to obviously what's happening in Minneapolis. Given the legal standards that we talked about earlier that ICE has and the assignments and the enforcement rules that they have you noticed that the assignment that's been given to them is matching what's actually been happening, what we're all seeing on the news and kind of that space?
Well, their assignment is to investigate, detain, and arrest individuals that they have probable cause to believe are in the country without proper documentation. That's really the mission. And what we've seen, I think, is that mission going off the rails, and ICE officers and Customs and Border Patrol officers acting in violation of the Constitution, in violation specifically of the Fourth Amendment. And as I stated earlier, arresting and detaining U.S. citizens, and additionally using unjustified excessive use of force. And so I'm very concerned about those transgressions, and I'm pleased to hear that the Trump administration is undertaking efforts to reduce the presence of ICE, kind of de-escalate the situation. That's a term that's been used, is to de-escalate the situation in Minneapolis, and hopefully work in closer collaboration with local Minneapolis law enforcement officers.
Yeah. Is there anything specific about Minneapolis or just the circumstances there that has made these interactions with ICE agents so aggressive? I know we saw it in Los Angeles, but something feels specific here. Is there anything?
What's interesting about Minneapolis is it isn't a city with a large Hispanic population. And so it raises the question in the first instance, well, why is ICE going to Minneapolis? There are, you could understand them going to California. You could understand them going to Los Angeles. Los Angeles has a very large Hispanic population, but Minneapolis doesn't. And so, what is the reason for going to this particular city? And by comparison, we haven't seen ICE, we haven't seen a surge of ICE agents in Texas, which has a very large Hispanic population. We haven't seen a surge of ICE agents in Florida, which also has a very large Hispanic population. So there seems to be some selective targeting of cities that doesn't seem to be consistent with the mission and the purpose of ICE to detain individuals who are in the country without lawful documentation.
Mm-hmm. And obviously this would just be speculation, but do you have any thoughts on why Minneapolis was selected, even though they don't have this high population of Hispanic people?
Well, I think initially there was some question that was raised, issue that was raised about the Somali population in Minneapolis, and there were some questions about some fraudulent activity that had taken place in Minneapolis involving the use of COVID funds. But again, why does that justify ICE agents being deployed in Minneapolis? That would be the role and purpose and function of the FBI to investigate any fraudulent use of federal funds. And so again, I am really lost for a reasonable explanation for this surge and concentration of ICE agents in Minneapolis, but yet no such action being taken in Arizona, in Texas, in Florida, and other states where there is a much stronger, larger Hispanic population.
And obviously, we're recording this on January 30th, and we know where things stand now. But do you anticipate that happening, like ICE agents being brought to these other states that have these high populations? Are you just unsure? I guess, what does that look like from your perspective?
Well, it's uncertain what the next steps are, because I think that the public has become very concerned with the use of ICE agents, their activities in Minneapolis, what they witnessed day in, day out over the last month, resulting in the killing of two innocent citizens. And so the question is whether the Trump administration is going to learn from its missteps in Minneapolis and then do a course correction with respect to how they proceed moving forward with this mission of detaining and removing individuals from this country that are not here lawfully. For me, I would hope that the course correction would take many different forms, and one of those would be removing the mask. For me, there's no legitimate law enforcement purpose for ICE agents and Customs Patrol agents to be masked, to have their faces disguised. You don't see it with Minneapolis police officers. We don't see it with FBI agents. We don't see it with law enforcement officers in other cities and states across the country. Second, they need to be wearing body cameras. Local law enforcement officers wear body cameras. This is very important to ensure, to verify whether the officers have acted lawfully or unlawfully. The body cameras are actually a good thing for law enforcement officers, because if they're acting consistent with the law, they haven't violated the law, then that will be displayed on the video cameras that they're wearing, the body cameras that they're wearing. And second, I think that the aggressive nature of these ICE agents really needs to be tampered down. It's just not justified. The use of force, the excessive use of force. And for me, I think that perhaps it goes to a more basic fundamental problem, which appears to be the training, the lack of training, especially for the Customs and Border Patrol officers who are not used to working in an large inner city metropolitan environment. And they're just not trained for that context or that setting or that environment. And they need to either be removed from the cities, or they need to be better trained to conduct law enforcement operations in large metropolitan cities.
And I know you obviously talked about building this trust back with not wearing the masks and being in marked vehicles and marked uniforms, but what else could be done or needs to be done by both the state and federal authorities to repair this relationship and restore trust between each other, but also with communities that they're working in?
Well, I think we're beginning to see some positive steps in that direction, and so it started with removing certain personnel from Minneapolis, specifically the former head of the Minneapolis ICE and Border Patrol surge, an individual by the name of Bobino, who has now been removed from that role and then is returned to his duties on the border in California. So I think it's bringing in new people who are willing to sit down, willing to discuss, willing to work together, listening to one another, listening to one another's concerns, and then addressing those concerns. And I think it's going to take a long time for these law enforcement relationships to be rebuilt. There's been severe damage, and it's going to take a long time for that damage to be corrected. But hopefully, there's movement now in a positive direction and that will continue moving forward. I also think that if there is such an action taken in other cities, let's say in Texas, Arizona, or Florida, that right from the beginning, we see meetings, discussions, collaboration with the relevant law enforcement agencies, listening again to one another. A big part of it is listening to what the concerns are on both sides, and then both sides compromising and taking positive steps to reach some type of productive compromise to develop a productive working relationship.
Anything that we touched on before that maybe you wanted to expand upon?
I don't know if you want to get into this at all, but I guess the next question is, based upon the shooting of the killing of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, is there likely to be is there going to be an independent investigation? Is there going to be accountability? What's going to happen? And following that, we have two people that have been killed, and by ICE and Border Patrol. I think Preddy was killed by Border Patrol agents. And so what's going to happen next?
Do you anticipate there being an investigation and kind of a criminal proceeding in that?
Well, President Trump has stated recently that he wants there to be I think he said an honest and truthful investigation involving both the killing of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And that's encouraging. But again, we need to move beyond words to actual action and implementation of that action. And so here we need to see, I think that state and local law enforcement, Minneapolis law enforcement agents need to be part of that investigation. They need to have access to the evidence in both of those cases to ensure that it truly is an independent and a full and impartial investigation. And if that investigation determines that there was unlawful action taken by ICE and Border Patrol officers, then they should be held accountable. And that could involve criminal proceedings and criminal prosecution and perhaps civil proceedings by the surviving family members of both of these victims.
Professor Gurulé, thank you so much for joining me and for explaining a difficult topic. Thank you for listening to the Indiana Lawyer Podcast. To stay up to date with what's happening in the legal community around Indiana, please visit our website at theindianalawyer.com. There you can subscribe to our daily newsletter, listen to more episodes from the podcast, and read news from across the IBJ Media company. You can also find us on social media.